Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Kicking off a couple minutes late here, but really excited to have you join me and Jeremy Pryor today for, I think, what's going to be a really valuable conversation for you about creating a business that serves your family. Over the last year or so, I've gotten to know Jeremy. He's local here in Cincinnati, where I live, or you live in Northern Kentucky, but
Yeah,
the
close enough.
area right around here. And I've been learning a lot from you and some of the people who have been around you and learning from you about fatherhood and how to run a household and a family that is both productive and serving God's kingdom effectively. So I really wanted to have you on specifically to talk about how to create a family how to create a business that serves your family. And there's a lot of conversation out there about pursue your passion and pursue your career kind of at any cost, hustle culture, or create some unicorn software and scale it up. And a lot of times in those conversations, the cost of those things isn't necessarily talked about. And very often that cost is your family and the things that when you get old, when you're 70, 80, and you're sitting around the dinner table and you're alone, those are the kinds of things you talk about. So I thought you'd be a perfect person to come on and dive into that a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely love trying to figure out earlier rather than later, like if the ladder is leaning up against the right wall, like, how are we actually thinking about our lives? Yeah. I think too much of our lives are lived culturally on autopilot. We're sort of handed values that sort of predictably break down as you get older. So yeah, that's kind of alarming and something I think, yeah, we need to talk about more overtly. So excited to dive into any of these topics.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting too because in our modern cultural context, it's very much built around the individual. What's important to you? What's your individual freedom? How do you use freedom to get more of what you want more often to, kind of enjoy life as much as you can versus, what it was for most of human history, which is how do you bring flourishing to your family, to your community, to those around you. And so, love for you to break down a little bit of how you see the difference between your vocation and your career, and then what role being a parent or being a father plays in career and vocation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm surprised by is that there really is not a place in our culture where it's appropriate to ask the question, am I primarily do what am I primarily living my life as an individual or in and through a community? And we just assume individual and we just kind of move forward as if we've all agreed on that and as if that's the way that life is naturally lived. And I think Naval, absolutely brilliant summarizer of all things, he said it best in terms of the way that this sounds to me in Western culture, and that is, he said in one of his tweets something like, "Life is a single player game. You're born alone, you live alone, you're gonna die alone." And that is the way most people believe that life is. And I'm not convinced that life is a single player game. In fact, I think that as you do get older and get closer to death, people realize, often for the first time, that it never was a single player game,
Mm.
which is a really unfortunate time to have that epiphany. I would sort of push back and say I think that life is designed to be a family centered game. Um, you are born into a family, you live your life in and with your family, and you die, God willing, surrounded by your family. That's the way that we're supposed to live life. Human beings are not designed to live life as hyper individuals. If you want to question that hypothesis, go to any nursing home and see what life is like when you have to spend the last decade of your life completely alone. And
Mm.
and you sense in your heart, this is not right. This is not the way it should be. But we've created this. Like we are all on the trajectory towards this hyper individual life. David Brooks said it best when he said that when Americans become wealthy, they purchase loneliness. And so we just assume that the lonely life, the kind of that you leverage wealth for the purpose of creating more and more like hyper individualism, more and more complete self sufficiency, and then that's a trajectory we're all on. And so I just want to take a big step back and say, yeah, like to your question about careers and vocations, like it has a huge impact. If you think that life is primarily supposed to be lived in and through a family, then why not think about that very early on when you're deciding what to do about work, right? We all need to work. We all have this problem, which is that we need to provide incomes for our families and for ourselves to survive. And so, no career counselor in high school or college that I know of ever sits down with people when they are filling out questionnaires, trying to figure out what career to go into, and says, "Hey, um, uh, is one of your primary goals to pick a career that will allow you to maximally spend time integrated with your family, your
Mm.
spouse and your kids?" That's not a question that most people ask, particularly of men. I mean, I think sometimes women will force that question if they're like, "I want to have kids and I want to spend time with my kids," but I've never ever in my life heard a man really say, "I'm going to design my career path around what will maximally integrate my life with my work life with my wife and kids." Um, Now, this is why I think the question this is really you have to take this big step back and say, well, if life is designed to live in and through the family, then maybe that is a question we need to ask more often. I heard one Amish person say that it is the goal within the Amish community to only live a lifestyle that will allow you to eat 3 meals a day with your family. Now
Ooh, I
imagine the
like
kinds
that.
of yeah, imagine the kind of careers that really limits your options. This is why they're out there with, horses plowing fields. Um, but I think that's a really valuable
With their
question.
kids, right? They're out there
Absolutely.
plowing with their family.
Exactly. Yeah. So you actually can think about this from an hours perspective. Like you can think about it from a meals perspective, the way the Amish do, or you could just break it down to hours. Like, how many hours do you want to be with your kids? How many hours do you want to be with your spouse? You want to be? Would you like it to be true that the vast majority of the time you spend at work is with people that aren't in your family? And
Mm.
I think that seems strange to me to design it. Like, and again, I'm not really thinking about somebody who's like, 30, 40, years old, really far down this road. But imagine we're like advising an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old about the kind of lifestyle they want to develop and the kind of career decisions they're going to make. It seems like it would be really helpful to maybe bring this up and ask the question, "Hey, um, you know, do you really think life is a single player game, right? Or do you want to live your life in and through your family?" Most people have never even asked that question. So I like stirring this up and saying, look, there's a question that needs to be asked before the career question, which is the lifestyle question. What do you think? What do you think life is really about? And so I think we have decided culturally that family is really less important than work. That work is a more is a higher status place to get identity than family. These are all decisions that we've made and that all of us were born into in the West as assumptions that I think ought
Yeah.
to be questioned.
No, I love that. I love what you're saying there, and it's kind of interesting too because it brings up a couple interesting kind of sub questions to that or sub thoughts. And one is, something that's gaining a ton of traction when we're talking about work and how to design work and how to design your life. The red pill movement, and this kind of men's empowerment movement is coming around, which,
Yeah.
from my perspective, and I know from your perspective too, is not a healthy response. Like
Right.
what we have going on in our culture right now, there's a lot of negative things, and that's out of response to things that are negative. But the response isn't to go the opposite way. And I think what's interesting about what you're saying is, the red pill movement is going to be, hey, be this like macho man that's going to attract, you know, the ideal mate and maybe like two or three or four or
Right.
whatever
Yes.
you can get, rather than saying, hey, what does a life well lived actually look like? What, when you get older, what is that life that you want to live? Is it being on your third marriage and having a 20-year-old model that you can go sleep with on the weekends? Like, is that really the ideal life? And in our culture they say it is, but then a lot of the people that are living that lifestyle, even if you're not looking through a biblical lens, are on drugs. They have a lot of problems, going on. And so, if from the time you're 18, you're thinking of designing a life like what you're talking about, you're going to end up attracting the kind of person who also wants to live that lifestyle. And you're most likely going to make a much better decision in who you marry if your goal is to create a life that revolves around your family and you're going to purposefully both make sacrifices to design that future life together And, I would say it still could be a little bit hard to find somebody like that, but I would say it's probably a lot easier for a normal person to take that path than to try to be the top 0.01% and
Right.
whatever you hear from the red pill side of things.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, these are all reactions to the breakdown of our design of the our design of the family. Where I agree with the red pill and with feminists is that the Western design of the family doesn't work very well. It underserves women, it underserves men, and so the response to that has been, okay, well, let's collapse back to our gender identities and go to war with each other. And one of the things that's so frustrating to me about this is that when men and women go to war, children lose, and God designed us to live life through families because of children. And it's not so if everyone is fighting for their own individual needs and everyone wants to really assume that the other gender is the bad guy, right? It's so important that if you're a man, you don't marry a woman who thinks that men are the enemy. And if you're a woman, you do not marry a man who thinks that men are the enemy. This is an absolutely disastrous foundation on which to build a marriage. But it
Yeah.
then backs us up to the question, why is this breaking down so badly? Like, what is going on in the culture? And it's very simple. And that is that our culture has decided that the highest value is individual self-expression. And if that is the highest value, then it's not difficult to imagine why marriages will break down. Um,
Yeah.
is when you're trying to express yourself, figure out like who am I, and you're always negotiating for what is in your best interest, and you're in it, you're locked in a lifelong covenant with another person who's also doing that. So you're in some kind of dystopian cage match with another person for fighting over the scarce resources of time and love and energy, and then throwing kids into that mix. And it's so obvious to see why this breaks down. And so this is why I think it is important. This is maybe going back to another foundational question, and that is to actually ask the question, what is the family? And this is the question that really kind of got to me, because I assumed the family was this place where you went to get your individual needs met. I didn't realize that that was such a dangerous way to view the family. And so I started seeing cultures, particularly in the Middle East, that really saw family as something fundamentally different. And you see cultures, for example, in India, the divorce rate's less than 1%. Can you imagine that? I mean, and so the idea that the family is inherently something that is dysfunctional and broken is 100% true in the West, but it's not true of the family. And so the only way I knew to really understand like how to recapture a functional version of the family was to look at cultures where families were highly functional, and then look at times in history where family was highly functional. And when you do that, you find a very different idea of family than the one we have in the West. And so I started to just decide, and my wife and I both decided just to adopt a completely different way of viewing family, one that is much more popular historically than the current version of the family, which is probably less than 100 years old. But man, is it ever so much more functional. Makes so much more sense of why you would be in a lifelong covenant. Makes so much sense of why you'd want to bring children and grandchildren into that structure. So we just have to admit, like our way of doing family is going to lead to these red pill feminist movements that are going to cause us to turn on each other. And we're just going further and further down this difficult and I think destructive pathway.
Yeah. So then how do you, it's like, because we could talk about family and all the different pieces of it for probably hours, but I want to kind of take a little bit of a turn and talk about, okay, so we're establishing that focusing on an individual identity is ultimately not going to function well as part of a family. And if you want to have a family structure, you have to think about family a little bit differently, maybe put on the hat or the lens of people in other cultures that do family well. So then if somebody listening to this and they go, okay, I kind of got that idea, I could buy into that. How do you start thinking more as part of a family unit and as holding a specific role in that family unit versus pursuing your own individual gain?
Yeah. Well, like everything else, it really starts with identity. Our culture really understands that. Our culture is obsessed with identity. We know that if you can decide or help somebody define who they are, you can really dictate their beliefs, their actions, their emotions. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of movements to try to like flood into the gap of people's, feeling that they lack an identity. So work does that. People, are obsessed with work identities. Sexual orientation has flooded into that gap where people are identifying as the deepest part of who they are, based on their sexual orientation or their gender. And this is why, of course, having the freedom to change genders becomes critical. If that is our core identity and that's been predetermined for us, then there could be almost nothing more, more enslaving than that, because now I'm locked into an identity I never chose and is my primary identity. No, I have to be able to, change that. So it starts there, and that intuition, that identity is absolutely paramount, is, I think, completely accurate. And so the thing that I'm sort of suggesting, kind of throwing into the mix, is, what about family identities? And so what about the identity of father, mother, son, daughter, wife, husband? These are incredibly deep identities, and we're sort of taught that they're cheap, and that to the extent that you identify too much with one of these identities, you are giving your power over to other family members who are going to abuse, that identity against you. And so we've been systematically trained not to think about those identities too deeply. And I think this is, again, another example of where this has become so dysfunctional culturally. So yeah, I would start there and say, okay, if we're going to figure out a different way to think that isn't, um, centered on individualism, you have to adopt an identity that's not fundamentally an individual identity. So that's one of the things that family identities really has going for them. They are designed around, service and giving, and they assume a relationship with someone else or with a whole group of other people. And so what we don't realize is that, identities are like dials, and you can dial up the degree to which you identify with a particular element of your identity. And so, this is why, there's been such a cultural move to get a hold of language. So, like, for example, in the area of sexual orientation, the decision to really, cause someone to dial up the degree to which they identify with their sexual orientation is really a movement of language, right? First and foremost, like,
100%.
you have to have a word for that. You have to have, and of course, that is happening with transgender, and it's same with work. Like, when you decide I'm Dr. So and so, or I'm a CEO, like, these are powerful words, right? That there's like, oh my gosh, I just got tons of status. Any identity that comes from, various degrees that we have. And so people don't walk around saying, I'm a father, I'm a mother, I'm a son, I'm a daughter. And, one of the things that blew my mind about Jesus was that when he came, his favorite title for himself was son. It's the most common thing he said about himself.
Mm.
He used that over and over again. Um, and then, he came to introduce us to God as our Father. And so, if you believe in Christianity, or that there's any divine revelation in the Bible, one of the things the Bible is seeming to suggest is that these family identities are so important and so high that they're really the ones that Scripture and God Himself most personally identifies with. And,
Mm.
all going all the way back to Abraham, who, if you read the story of Abraham, he was very much, on par or even more powerful than many of the kings in his day. Most kings, monarchs, during Abraham's time, ruled over cities. But there was even a story where Abraham, conquers 5 kings, but he never wanted to call himself anything but father. He's been known throughout history as Father Abraham. His name means father. And so, I think it's important to actually decide on these dials. Like, do I want to dial up my work identity, dial up my gender identity, dial up as you crank up those dials, what's actually happening is they're connected to other dials, right? They're connected to other identities. And so you're simultaneously dialing down your family identities while you're dialing up these other identities. And so part of what I just want to encourage people to consider is what would happen if you suddenly just cranked your family identities. And particularly if you're a father or mother. I understand if you're a son or daughter, you're like, I have a toxic relationship with my parents. Do I really want to give them that much power by saying I really care about this, this identity? But man, when you start a family and you've made a covenant and you're from your own free will with your husband or with your wife, and then you begin to start having children, who you're going to call son or daughter, then I would say, man, it's amazing to just to make the decision. I'm going to dial up my family identity.
Yeah, that I it's so interesting because I mean, even saying something like what you're talking about sounds so countercultural. I mean, it is countercultural, but it's kind of amazing how countercultural it is. I mean, it just makes me think of the whole recent, surprisingly controversial thing where Harrison Butker, the kicker from the Chiefs,
Yeah.
goes and talks about, similar idea to what you are. He's like, my vocation is as a father, and my wife's vocation is as a mother. And then all of a sudden, it's like
Yeah.
outrage. People are ripping their hair out, and I mean,
Yes.
literally cussing him out for saying
Yeah.
something that shouldn't be abnormal. Like, if
No.
you are a parent,
Yeah.
your primary identity is as a parent. And I get the idea of like, you don't want to lose yourself, and I get the point of what they're saying. And I think there's, if you go on the other extreme and you're the only thing you ever focus on is that one piece, then I can understand, some idea behind that. But on the flip side, it's like, but we're sacrificing the thing that's actually going to bring life and value to our family and to ourselves in the long run. Like,
Yeah.
okay, sure. Maybe in your 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe even getting into your 50s, focusing solely on your individual identity, that might bring you value. But then the younger, when you're under 20 or when you're over 50, all of a sudden that
Right.
starts flipping. And if
Yeah.
you're focusing only on 2 or 3 decades of your life versus not only your entire life, but even the generations beyond you and what you're giving to them.
Right.
And if we think, as back to our parents, whether they did a good job at this or not. I mean, I feel like my parents actually overall did a really good job at what we're talking about. But so many people look back and they're frustrated with their parents for not being involved or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like, man, if you want to do something different for your kids, maybe it's worth doing something that's a little bit countercultural. Maybe if things aren't working out for you or your friends or the people you're seeing around you, maybe it's time to start saying, hey, maybe the things we're identifying with aren't valuable.
Right.
So just to kind of shift again over towards creating, because the name of this is create a business that serves your family. So then, okay, if we're embracing this idea of, okay, I am first a husband, I have 4 kids, so I'm a father. My identity then is as a father and as a husband, and that's my primary vocation. That's my primary calling. That's what I'm going to focus my attention on, especially over the course of my life. So then, when I'm thinking about my career choices, when I'm thinking about what I'm building for myself, for my family, for my kids, how do we start thinking, like, how does that shift the way that we create our business? Like, if you're going to start a business, you're an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
but you're going to embrace a family identity. What does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it does start with just having the perspective that the work I'm doing and starting this business is not as an entrepreneur, it's as a father or as a mother. And our language really betrays what we believe about these things. And so when you go to work, do you primarily put on this identity as an entrepreneur or as a business builder? Or are you saying I'm a father, going out to really build an income stream for my family? And so I'm going to, gather my family around me and say, hey guys, every single day that I go off to work, you are sending daddy out as a representative of this family to go out and to build something on behalf of the family. And you have to make good on that language by making sure that, if there are moments or elements of your work where you're like, this is not really blessing my family, this is really about me. I'm gonna go on this trip and it has nothing to do with, it's just something that I want to do to be able to kind of build up my separate individual identity. You have to be honest about that and say, okay, am I really doing this as a father or as a mother, or am I doing this as an individual? And so you have to start to think that way. You have to start using language that way, and you have to make decisions in line with what's consistent with that way of thinking. So that can be really hard for people because no one's expecting you to do that. Every time you go to work, everyone's assuming that you're putting on the individual identity. One of the things I was kind of presenting this idea to a group of entrepreneurs once, and I had a picture of Charles Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie. He's got this white hat, that he has this kind of farmer's hat. And one of the things I point out is like, look, at this time in history, if you watch that TV show or read, the books by Laura, you can tell that basically that man, he's wearing the same hat all the time, literally in the show, but figuratively everywhere he goes, he's a father. Like, and you even see these moments in the show where anytime the kids are interrupting him, he's not primarily thinking about what's going on in this interruption as, hey, I'm inhabiting a work identity, stay away. Like I'm trying to build something very separate from myself. He's completely a father every single minute of the day when he's working, and when you can think about a job that way. Now it's difficult because in a lot of jobs, they insist so much, and it's understandable why they do this. They insist on a firewall between your family and your work because they're like, we own you. We purchased you for this 40 hours, this 50 hours. Like
Yep.
you're on our clock and you're stealing from us if you integrate any other identities, whatever they are, into the time we're paying you to work. But this is why I'm such a huge fan of asset building and business building and entrepreneurship, because you could decide as an entrepreneur to just say, look, I'm gonna let my business take a 5% hit. I want to be 95% efficient. And I'm going to integrate my relationship with my wife or my relation with my husband or my kids in some kind of way that's appropriate, that allows me to do really good work. But it's going to take a little bit more time. It's going to be a little inefficient at times. But it's like the price the business pays for my integration because I own the business. That's what we're going to decide to do. And man, one of the things that's amazing as a business owner is you get to choose, you get to decide what values are really going to be championed in that business. And so you can say, no, I want the firewall between my individual work and my family. You can make that decision as an entrepreneur, or you can decide to dial up that integration.
Okay, we got a good question here. And I actually got a question like this before on the post too. Why is it important to identify if it's an individual identity or a father identity? Like, I think basically, what's the juxtaposition? Does it have? Are they opposed to each other by nature, or is there maybe a way to kind of bring the two together?
Yeah. The real question is which is paramount, which is nested inside of which. So I do think we have individual identities. One thing that's amazing about the West is we are better than any culture in human history at promoting individual identities, right? If your kid wants to be a violinist and you live in America, thank God we've got lots and lots of help for you. If your kid wants to be a baseball player or wants to be a writer, like there's tutors, there's educational opportunities. We can really develop individual identities in a great way in our culture. But the question that I'm asking or trying to answer is, what's the ordering of the identities? So to me, when I work, my fathering identity is paramount, and my individual work identities are nested underneath my father identity. That brings integration into the way I work. So if at any point there's a tension between my desire to increase my individual identity, hey, if we move to this place and I take this promotion, it's going to give me a tiny boost in my work, and because that's paramount. Obviously, that's the decision we're going to make, even though it comes at enormous cost to our family. Well, if you're really primarily trying to provide and build a life for your family, then you're going to make that decision differently. So I think it's important to order identities, not necessarily say that all I want to be is a father all the time and I never think about these individual identities. No, I think individual identities have a place, and I think that we should promote them, and we should explore them, and we should help our children discover all the different aspects of their gifts and their talents and their passions. But I think that we need to help order identities. And so when you have a gift or a passion, let's say one of your kids is like obsessed with soccer, they'll never be a professional soccer player. They just really, really enjoy it. And this is an individual identity they're really pursuing, but it's just coming at an enormous cost to the family. And it's destroying, your ability to have any kind of rhythm or cohesion as a family. Then these identities collide, and it's important to have some way to work through the decisions. And because culturally we've decided individual identities are higher, this is why it's going to predictably rip families apart. This is also why it's very difficult to have lots of children. As soon as in a family that primarily thinks about their their roles as individual identities, what you have is really a fixed pie of resources the family has, and every single time you have another child, they're getting a smaller piece of that pie. So you would be able to go out for basketball and baseball, but because now we've got a third or fourth kid, you can only do one sport, right? This is the kind of thing that happens in a Western family. But if you think
Yep.
about family as a team, that completely changes. Like, you don't get upset when a new teammate comes and joins the team with their own gifts and talents and things that they're bringing to the team, but it does necessitate you thinking about the actual entity as a team. So that's just an example of like, yeah, you want to order the identities according to a hierarchy. And And you already are. I'm not sort of presenting this as sort of like a something that you should now do. You're already doing it. Everyone does it. Every single person has a very fixed hierarchy of identities they're already living through, and it's the primary story through which they're telling themselves about their life. It's how they're making their decisions. I'm just saying we got to get really explicit about that, and I think we need to like really wrestle with when we make a decision that, hey, my work identity is more important than my role as a mother or wife, or my role as a father or husband. um, wow, like, are you sure you want to make that
Yeah.
decision?
Yeah. And then, I mean, Vince asked a follow up question, and I think this will kind of get at the heart of what he's talking about. Like, should you, uh, is it wrong to operate out of an individual identity, or should you operate kind of only as a father? Um, and he's saying as a business owner, he's seen himself operating out of both, and kind of, appreciates that you're mentioning the order of identities. But I think what you said there is basically like, hey, look, your first and highest calling is as a father. And so if what you're doing for work is constantly causing you to put your fatherhood identity aside, and there's no end in sight, there's no end game where what you're doing is benefiting your family, you're not working towards how you're going to be able to sow into your family better, might be worth reconsidering that, especially if
Right.
it's something where you say, hey, I'm a Christian, I believe in biblical principles, especially if that's true, then, you know, I would argue, and I think from what you're saying that you would argue that it's your calling to prioritize
Right.
fatherhood over work in the long haul. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in the short run there aren't choices that you're going to purposefully make, that are, maybe you're going to go work for 2 years somewhere where you're traveling a significant amount
Right.
to create an opportunity for your family
100%.
moving forward in the long run.
Yes.
And you might need to develop an individual identity that helps you to provide for your family more effectively in 5 years from now. But that
Yes.
means a sacrifice over the next 2 or 3, but where you're making that choice consciously,
Yes.
understanding the impact it has on your family, rather than just saying, well, I'm going to focus on this only and let the cards fall where they will with my family and the impact.
Yeah. That's very really well said, Joe. I think that a lot of times when people hear us talk about family identities, they think we're talking about working very few hours or something. That's not at all what we're saying. It's just like what you just said. Oftentimes, being a father could mean working 50, 60 hours for months at a time in a startup because it's what's best for your family. The question is really, which identity are you operating from to make those decisions? And if it's an individual identity, your kids and your spouse will feel it. They feel the difference. You talk about it differently, and ultimately you do make different decisions. But it's not as obvious as, oh, somebody who's really inhabiting their fatherhood or motherhood identity, only works if the smallest number of hours that they possibly can. No, of course not. You're first asking the question, what does my family need, and so how can I engage in the marketplace in a way that ultimately blesses my family. Now, I know this is incredibly countercultural, but this is all being discussed here in the backdrop that in America we are at ground zero of the destruction of the family. The United States is the number one country in the world at single parent households. The number one country in the world. There's no other country in the world. We just passed Sweden, and so
Which
whatever.
is the number one predictor of poverty, of generational
Yes,
poverty.
there's so
So
many problems with this. So we have to admit that we've gone the farthest down some road that is destructive to the family. We are the farthest down that road. And so since you live at ground zero, one of the things you have to be really careful of is if there are intuitions that you're gonna be like, oh, that doesn't feel right. Whatever is right is gonna feel really wrong to people in our culture because we are the farthest down this road. So we have to have some uncomfortable conversations. We have to be willing to question some sacred assumptions. And I think the sacred assumption I really want to question to begin with is the assumption that the individual identity is paramount. I think that that's at the root of the problem.
okay, so we want to try to tie everything together. So we're saying, okay, if you're going to identify with fatherhood or motherhood as your primary identity, and then you're going to design your life around that, and then we're going to say that that's your primary identity. That doesn't mean that you're not going to become really good at something that's going to help you make money in the long run, but it's really seeing things through this long-term filter. And
Right.
so saying, hey, what are we doing today design the life and family for us today, for us tomorrow, and even for generations in the future. What are we doing? What are we building?
Yeah.
So then if you're going to think that way, how does that impact the way that you design a business?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that it's if it's in the foundation of the business itself, there's different like sort of decision trees in the context of starting a business that this will come into play predictably, right? So the first one that I'm very like that a lot of people are surprised by, but I'm extremely conscious of is the if you want to build a multi-generational family team, that is a family that works together and that works across generations. One of the first things that I get really concerned about are businesses that never ever give you time freedom. So they're always going to you're always going to make your money from the hours you put in. What happens in those kinds of businesses is that there's a predictable pathway that as you reach closer and closer to your highest earning potential, usually in your 50s, those are the moments when you are going to bear the most responsibility and have the least amount of access to your time. You know, right as your kids are becoming adults, you know, right as your first grandchildren are being born, oftentimes in those decades of your life. And so, one of the things that I decided to do, this happened to me when I was my my late 20s. I went to a board meeting with a business owner, and he had three sons. They were mostly in their like early 30s, and I was going to this board meeting. He was an investor in one of our companies, and so he was leading this board meeting every month. And one day I just sat there and looked at him and I realized he spends more time with his sons in their 30s than any father I know spends with their kids in their own home because he owns his
Wow.
business and and he integrated his sons into his businesses. Now, I made a decision at that moment. My decision wasn't I will work with my kids. My kids must work with me. I will determine their future. No. What I did decide at that moment in my late 20s is I want to live the kind of lifestyle that would make that an option for my children someday. They have to decide voluntarily to do that. But I decided I do want to live the kind of lifestyle, and it's a good time to decide that in your late 20s. So what I did is subtly over time, every time a business opportunity would come, or it was it's an opportunity to like increase this part of the business or decrease that part of the business, or somebody comes to wants to sell a business to us or whatever. That was a pretty major lens through which I looked at every decision about business, what we were starting, what we were doing is this getting me closer to that lifestyle that I really want in my 50s? I'm going to turn 50 in about 2 weeks. So I'm knocking on the door of that time frame. And it was like a compass, right? That it wasn't that just helped me kind of maneuver our family closer and closer to the lifestyle that I saw there that I wanted for our family. So that's why I think one thing that's really important when you're a business owner or have access is you want to look 10 or 20 years into the future and try to really increase the resolution of what is going to be what is your lifestyle going to look like. And because you're a business owner, you have so much ability to shape what that, through subtle decisions you can make. You could decide I want to be a solopreneur and not I don't want to have a lot of responsibility. I don't want to lead a large organization. So I'm going to like, intentionally make the company small, or I'm going to hire somebody for the CEO position and step aside and let them take over at a certain point. Or I'm going to sell the business and invest in real estate and capital intensive assets that our family can collectively manage. It's sort of like a family office. There's lots of decisions you can make like that, but you can only make those decisions in line with the family vision if you have a family vision. So
Yeah.
I'm a fan of like actually writing down like, the ages of your kids in 10 years from now, and then just, spending an hour dreaming about what that season 10 years from now you want it to look like.
Yeah. So one thing that's really interesting because you talked about dialing up fatherhood versus individuality. So I think one knee jerk reaction people would have, and probably that I like a concern that I would have when somebody listens to you. You get these people who are going to take what you're saying and they're going to take it as it is, which is, hey, I need to think about this, start moving more towards that, and make really smart long-term decisions, and make changes over time. And you're going to have the people who listen and they're going to be like, that's it, I'm firing all my clients and doing something totally different tomorrow. But maybe that's a good idea, but most of the time, you know probably not. So it's like the idea that you just talked about was more like, hey, I see that my life is moving towards something that in 20 years from now is not going to serve me or serve my family.
Right.
But I see this other person over here who's living a life that I want to live more like that. And then you start changing the dial. You're changing your fatherhood dial up, and your entrepreneur hat maybe even down a little bit, or at least changing the way that you're looking at it.
Right.
And I think one thing that people can do, especially if you're just starting your business, is to be thinking about how you're designing your business from the beginning, your business model from
Right.
the beginning of how you're doing it. So, if for me personally, I don't I don't do well doing exactly the same thing over time. And I'm not going to be able to be present for my family if I'm in 35 hours of meetings where I'm basically doing the same thing every single time for clients. And so then the way that I'm working on designing my business is to do it in a way where I'm able to give my best to my family because I'm not totally fried every day. But what that takes right now is a lot more work to get those pieces together, and to make all of that work and fit together. But it's being intentional about that business design. And early on it might not be feasible to do that business design. You might have to take jobs that you don't want to pay the bills and get things going. But it's these little subtle decisions that you make, like, hey, that's a client that I know is going to really fry me, and
Yeah.
I'm going to purposefully choose to turn that down because that's not going to move me closer to the type of business that I want, or the employees that you hire, or any of that are decisions that, if you're conscious about it and how that's going to impact you and your family over time, you can start turning those dials so that in a year or two or three or five, you're in a completely different place than you are today.
Yes. Totally. Yeah, it's difficult. And, the way that I coach families I coach about 100 families a year that are moving from employment into asset building income for the sake of their families. And probably the most surprising thing I tell them early on is that you have to start three businesses, not one. Now I'm talking to usually a father of, he's got children. And so I walk through sort of the progression of three different businesses. This almost like three legs of a stool that really cause a family to become stable in an environment, in a entrepreneurial environment. And almost all the people that I coach are not entrepreneurs. They're not wired like entrepreneurs. They're good hard workers. Um, and I believe a good hard worker with good entrepreneurial coaching can oftentimes outperform an entrepreneur. And I've seen it over and over again. But they do need coaching, because the thing an entrepreneur has that a kind of a hardworking non-entrepreneur doesn't have is creative problem solving abilities. One of the things that I think terrifies non-entrepreneurial people when they try to own assets, start businesses, is they can picture themselves slamming into some kind of decision that they cannot think their way out of, which makes sense because that's the power of an entrepreneur. They oftentimes they're such good creative problem solvers that they're just confident they'll figure it out. But not everybody has that ability. But anyway, I talk about these three businesses: a freedom business, which is usually a service-based business where you can take all the money out of the business every single month without hurting the business. I always want to start families there. If you're providing for a family right now, that's where I like you to start. Almost everybody has in their head when they think about entrepreneurship, Shark Tank or tech startups. We've all just been infected by these stories, these unicorn stories, and the 99% of businesses are not like that at all. And so that's a really difficult thing for people to overcome in terms of just their mindset. But then once they've got a freedom business and they've really figured out some kind of service they can provide where they're pulling all the money out, but it's oftentimes too tied to their time. So they're not really getting that time freedom, but they're getting amazing business skills. They're getting access to their time. They're also really understanding an industry well. And within that industry, then we try to look for an opportunity for a scale business, right? These are businesses that you can launch that will allow you to make money in a way that is not tied to your time. And if that succeeds, if you could build that scale business and it starts to produce enough cash flow, then you want to start a third business, a legacy business, and that is capital intensive assets. Could be real estate, could be paper assets, but things that will allow your family to make money from the money. If you have all three legs of that stool, that's a very stable place from which to build your financial picture for a family that's moving out of predictable employment situations into asset ownership. But if you just have one leg of that stool, oftentimes, you hear the horror stories of the stool collapsing and then people really putting their family at risk. I think that people
Yep.
that are young, you can take bigger risks. You can jump right into a scale business. You don't have a lot to lose. You're living in your mom's basement. Just go for it. But man, if you got young kids, it's like, hey, be careful what you do in this
Yeah.
transition. It's worth it,
Yep.
but you need coaching and you need you need to do it in a particular sequence so that your family is able to make the transition in a safe manner.
Yeah, so that's a perfect transition to how do people find out more about you? You know, if they're going, hey, I like this idea. I like the idea of creating a business around my family versus the other way around, and setting those priorities right. How do they get that coaching, and how do they find out more about what you're up to?
Yeah, so we have something called Family Inc. You know that's what I'm describing, the coaching program. You can go to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. and join the wait list. Two or three times a year, we open it up. It sells out really quickly, so make sure you get on the wait list if you want to join us, and you'll get all the information there. There's a bunch of about what we do and how the coaching works. It's a year-long coaching program. So I love, it's one of my favorite things I get to do. So yeah, I can jump over there. And if you just want to follow us, Family Teams, on all the socials, yeah, you can do that there as well.
Yeah, well, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining today. This is a really great conversation, and I've really, like I said at the beginning, learned a lot from you, and our family has really benefited. So know that anybody who's going to follow what you're doing will be blessed and benefited from it.
Awesome. Thanks, Joseph. Great to be here with you.